So we want to welcome everybody today, but also those of you that are going to be watching this at a later date as you work through the different modules that we're videoing and sharing today or with you on EdHub. Today we're going to be focusing on multiple opportunities to respond and give feedback. How can we give immediate feedback in that setting? And it is our fourth in a continued series, so we'll relate back to a few of the things that we've been talking about before, but more importantly, we're going to, oh, there you just went. There we go. Who is in the chat? We do have a few people from DPI. Kate is always here with us to oversee, and we want to thank DPI and our legislatures for providing us the money and opportunities so we can build this. We have different members of our local REAs that are able to join us and bring their expertise. And then, of course, we have those of you that are here. So, Nicole, we want to thank you for joining us. And then you can convince Amber that she needs to talk and we'll look at it later, okay? We have focused on explicit instruction in the last couple math chats that we've done, and especially we've looked at the guided practice and teacher modeling. This is just an extension of that. When we're doing guided practice, when we're doing modeling, there's a lot of overlap that occurs between them, but what does it look like when we put it into practice? How can we get the number of examples that we want to get in there? Last year, we only had 39% of our students that were proficient in North Dakota. So as we're thinking about that, and our goal is to get 80% of them proficient, what are we going to do in order to reach that? We can see the effect sizes on the screen for guided practice teacher modeling. When we combine that with specific feedback and sequencing examples and getting them multiple practice opportunities, we're going to build towards that proficiency. The guided practice and specific feedback are the two areas that we're really going to dig into more and look at today. More specifically, in the guided practice, we're in that area of the second step. If we have explicitly taught the skill, we've worked on acquisition, we have gone through our examples and did our teacher modeling. As we move into that guided practice with the students, how are we going to get the output from them? Too much of our time in classrooms often is spent in input. It's one of the reasons explicit instruction kind of gets a bad name because people view it as being a top-down model, or we focus a lot of time on lectures or on taking notes, where what should really be happening is we are providing correction procedures to the students. We're updating them on what's happening. We're going to go back to modeling when needed, but the students are going to be doing most of the work. We want them to spend at least 2/3 of the time in practice when we have them in our classroom, and only 1/3 of the time. Now, we talked about in further modules that came before this, you might not go nicely in that order. It's not that we go, I do, we do, you do, which is the way our math classes often operate, or how our books operate that we use as our main resources. We might go, I do, you do. Oh, you aren't ready to do. We need to go back to the I do, and then to you do, and then to independent practice. And we might hopscotch back and forth a little bit as we do that. Always within there, we're giving them feedback and we're giving them extra practice to respond. We've looked at the instructional hierarchy through the state of Pennsylvania. We have REAs, Regional Education Associations, within North Dakota. Theirs are called something different, but it's really something similar. And they have put together this instructional hierarchy specifically for math. And when we think about what this looks like, we have spent a lot of time in the acquisition level. And within the acquisition level, we provide our direct explicit instruction, demonstrating, modeling. But the important part is the extra practice and the immediate corrective feedback that we can do during that time. So when we look back at that instructional hierarchy, today we'll be focusing at the end towards of that acquisition level and moving into the proficiency level and building fluency with the math standards or math skills that we want them to get. In that acquisition level, immediate feedback. What does immediate feedback mean? Elaborate feedback. What does it mean for us to elaborate on the feedback that we're given the students? We're going to spend it in that instructional, multiple opportunities to respond. We'll start to delay the feedback a little bit, but it's still important that we give them feedback, vary the tasks that we give them, and provide goals and motivation in order to keep them moving. Our red line shows how if we work within this model, our errors should keep decreasing. Our performance should continue to improve. But if you notice in the acquisition level, that performance is not getting very high. We need to provide lots of opportunities to respond. We need to give them feedback so that they're doing it correctly if we want them to build up and be able to get to the mastery stage and be able to carry this information with them when we go to a different topic. If we superimpose the gradual release model over our instructional hierarchy model, we can see that the explicit modeling and guided practice occur both within that acquisition level, and the practice continues on and feeds into that independent practice level before they're practicing by themselves. We looked at the classroom instruction that works within the last module, but then we were looking at that explicit instruction and modeling portion. Today, we're going to look down to the next phase. The students need to make sense of learning. And during that phase, we connect it to new knowledge. We bring manageable constraints to it. We bring mental models. We have them do lots of guided initial application with formative feedback. This is where we're focusing on before we move into that extra retrieval practice and before we get them into guided investigations and problem solving and ability to apply what they have learned. Why do so many kids struggle to learn math skills? Well, we don't explicitly teach it till we're confident that they've reached mastery, and or we haven't given them enough feedback so that we correct any mistakes or misconceptions they have. But I think the last part is the most important. We fail to realize the amount of practice that it takes for them to maintain and keep those skills. Especially we have those 4 or 5 students that get it, and they're starting to probably be off task. And so we get ready and we move on. And although those 4 or 5 kids are ready to move on, the bottom line is the rest of our class isn't. So what's that going to look like? Often we hear multiple opportunities referred to as OTRs, opportunity to respond. Research is very clear that the more opportunities we give students to respond, the more output that comes from them and not just input that's going into them. We will have better on-task behaviors, we will have better engagement, and this doesn't matter whether we're talking about students with disabilities or without disabilities. It doesn't matter if we're talking about kindergarten or high school or even college level. During small group, whole group, we can intensify our instruction, we can improve behavior, we can provide behavioral supports for students simply by increasing the number of opportunities to respond that we give them and the amount of feedback we give them to make sure that it's correct. This information is taken from the Iris Peabody Vanderbilt website. And one of the things that's exciting on there is they do offer courses specific to different areas of instruction. And I really like the table they give us for what are the steps that it would take to implement more opportunities to respond. And it's really very simple. It's not just isolated to math. If you're a teacher that teaches elementary school, or you have different classes that you teach during the day, a couple social studies periods, a couple math periods, the philosophy and the information and the research shows that it's going to work. If we have to know the list of questions or prompts or problems. What is it that we need to have them do? So after I decide what that content is going to be, I need to create a list of questions, or if I've taught this class for a while, I probably can come up with them off the top of my head, but I have to know what it is we're going to do and plan for it ahead of time. What's the method I will use to ask those questions? You could do it with note cards. You could do it with presentation slides. You can do it with whiteboard. You can do it with your active board. You can do it with Kahoot. The bottom line, though, is we just need multiple opportunities for all students to respond, not just one or two of them. Then when we get down to number 4, ask a minute of 3 questions per minute. It's pretty awesome what we can think of, the amount of increase in opportunities to respond we can have if we move at a little brisker pace and give all the kids opportunities to respond, rather than taking the time to call on 1 or 2 students, or to have there's nothing wrong with it in the right place, but we have different opportunities where we roll a dice or we draw an ice or a ice cream stick and the kid's name is on it. Well, that's great, but that's still only one person that's responding, not all of them. And when they're responding, we're constantly collecting formative information so that we can give feedback based on their answers. So whatever method we use, it should be something that we can scan the responses quickly, give the right answer, and if necessary, give corrective feedback, so that the time that question comes back again a little bit later, the students are going to have a second opportunity to answer it correctly. What does that mean in the case of numbers? Okay, so let's say we have a 30-minute lesson, and in that 30 minutes, we provide 22 opportunities to respond for every student. So if I have a whole class response, that would be 22 answers that every single student gives. Or if I divide it among my class, that would be 1.5 responses per student. If I look at that over a whole 180 days, if those kids have responded 22 times during one class period, that's 3,700 responses per student. If I'm calling on students or they're volunteering, whichever way we do that, that would only be 270 responses by the time we have got through an entire year of instruction. The more we engage them, the less likely we're going to have disruptive behaviors, the more confident the students will be, the more successful they are, the more likely they will continue to work harder and to be successful in the future. There's 2 reasons why we provide multiple opportunities to practice and respond. The first one is student engagement and participation. We can bring it and relate it to the prior skills we've done before. We can give the student opportunities to practice the skills in a variety of ways. We can practice problem solving. We always talk about students. One of the big problems is having them solve story problems. Well, let's solve them together. And when we think about how are we going to increase the number of students' opportunities to respond, we need to just take the time to prepare more items for practice. Go ahead and have choral responses. It works great. I don't care what grade level you're teaching at. Think, pair, share. Have them think and talk to the partner next to them. And when we're talking about white class or math classes, mini whiteboards every day, mini whiteboards multiple times throughout the class period. There's multiple ways that we can do this. Like, when would we do it? When they have a new skill, we should practice that new skill multiple times, not all in the same day. Break complex problems down into smaller chunks and have them answer each chunk of the problem before you move to the next step. They can't be right in the entire process unless we're sure they're right as we go through each separate step of the problem. Use a stack of note cards or flashcards for drill and practice. Flashcards are still in research shown to be one of the best ways to help kids drill and practice, remember. And we hate the drill and practice, right? That makes us a little nervous. But the bottom line is if we're not practicing and if they're not getting enough practice in, we're not giving them the opportunity to achieve what they're capable of achieving. We just keep moving on and their only deficit is not enough practice. If you have any type of pinch cards or response cards, you can have them answer yes or no that they agree with an answer. It's great to have non-examples in there so that you can have them agree or disagree with what's the right answer. You can have thumbs up, thumbs down. There's all kinds of ways you can do that physically. But think about the grouping. We can do it in multiple group settings and whole group right now, if we have less than 50%, and some research says less than 60% of our class proficient, we should be doing a lot of our interventions with whole group. We could have them in small group. We can have it in guided practice, beginning of the bell to the end of the bell. That's another instructional strategy that's really shown to improve student achievement. Homework doesn't have nearly the effect size or show improvement that simply having our kids work and practice all the time that we have them in class with us. In 7th grade, one of the teachers was in the course for FEME, and they talked about slow motion math problems. So after he represents and does a work example in class, then the kids do it on their whiteboard and hold it up and show it to him. This allows him to give immediate feedback every time they hold their whiteboard up. He can look at it and give feedback, decide what he needs to reteach, decide what he needs to look at. And the pictures are from an 8th grade class. But if you look at the slow motion math problem on the side, he even talks about year 12 students working things out on a whiteboard. If you do not have many whiteboards and or you don't have the budget to buy them, there's some simple, easy ways that we can create our own whiteboard. If we simply get plastic sleeves that cover up a piece of paper and slide a piece of paper, of white paper in there, we can make our own whiteboard to use a dry erase marker with. If you go to Lowe's or Menards or any of those places, you can buy big wall-sized pieces of whiteboard that you can cut into smaller and make your own individual whiteboards if the cost of ordering them individually isn't in your budget right now. But whiteboards is one of the things that we can take advantage of the most if we want to get in multiple opportunities to respond and be able to give immediate feedback. As many as 30 to 40 students in a room can show you their whiteboard, and you can walk around and take a quick glance and decide, do I need to do more problems? Do I need to reteach? If 80% of our kids are getting it right, we do 1 or 2 more problems and we move on. If they aren't, we do 1 or 2 problems until we figure that they're starting to get bored or restless, and we go on to something else, but we bring it back tomorrow or the next day. When you do whiteboards or any type of routine, make sure you think about the plan. Don't just think you're going to put whiteboards into a classroom of a bunch of 8th graders that have not done this before. If that hasn't been the normal routine, make sure you define the expectation of how they're going to use them. Practice those expectations, plan for it, hold them accountable. One of the things that you're going to find is they're going to want to completely clean off their desk before they get started. No, tell them right away, you're going to pull your whiteboard out, you're going to set it down right on top of everything that you've been working on. You're going to put the cap of your marker on the back of your marker so that you don't use it. You're not going to hold the marker board up until I say ready, set, show. Whatever you want those expectations to do, make sure you plan and share that before you just hand them the whiteboards. Another one, whiteboards, I'm sometimes told that that's too elementary. My kids aren't going to use it. High school kids will work with whiteboards. If you're lucky enough to have a classroom that has whiteboards around half or 2/3 of it, instead of mini whiteboards, sometimes it's an awesome thing to have the students go to the whiteboards on the wall and work out the problem. We're going to, I have to take a look. If you look online, this says 360-degree whiteboards. In the resources that are provided for you on EdHub, that link will take you to a video. We're not going to take the time to watch it now, but it really does do a nice job of showing all the way from 3rd grade to high school as their examples of what this might look like. I really liked one of the examples that they showed was a think partner, and there's 2 partners and they each have a different colored marker, and you observe and watch the other one think aloud and walk through it, and you prompt and you give them hints if they're not sure what they're doing or where they went wrong, and then you trade places on the next problem, and they just went back and forth. The teacher had some really good information on how she's made that work, but whiteboards, if you're lucky, 360 degrees all the way around your room. Another quick and easy thing to do are what's referred to as pinch cards or show cards. They might be listed somewhere else. This one is specific to what it might look like in math. We use these today for adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing integers to see what the kids knew and remembered and were able to do. And because they have the plus sign on the front and on the back, when I hold it up, I can see quickly from the front of the room or the side of the room if they are answering correctly and what it looks like. And I can scan and give them immediate feedback without having to go to the next problem. So what does that look like? If we take a look here, the problem, -15, inside that box, we have to add an add, subtract, multiply, or divide symbol in order to make this a true equation. So the kids decide what is the correct operation. They hold it with their fingers and they hold it up so that we can talk about. It tells me if I should take a 1 or 2 minute chance to reteach this or if I should go to the next problem. And we just continue through a number of problems. We can get through all 6 problems in 2 minutes or less, including my formative assessment, collecting the data from looking at the room. Are we getting it? Is this something we have? If you take a look at the bottom one, it's always good to include examples and non-examples. So if we look at that very last one, it usually takes a minute or 2, but some student will recognize that, hey, this one doesn't work. You want to include that in there because that will tell you whether they really know and understand what it is they're learning. But we can get through a lot of problems. We could use technology to do this, but the bottom line is if it's only going to take 3 minutes, getting the technology open and working and putting the technology is going to take a lot more time than simply pulling out a pinch card. Now, this is the example. Also, if you're an elementary teacher, you can use it for fact and opinion. Make cards that have fact, opinion, have a card that says yes, no, maybe, anything that they can respond to a question and you can look at quickly will work. Another thing to consider is low stakes practice sessions. This is an example from Heart River Elementary School in Dickinson. And the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade teachers identified what are the things our kids need practice in. What are the things that we are not sure that they are really fluent and that they will remember and take it with them on to next year. And from that, we took and made what we would consider a practice. Open up another slide here for you. So for third grade, based on the things that were listed, what is it we need to know and be able to do? They said kids had trouble adding and subtracting their addition and subtracting facts. So you could play, they played finger wars. What do I need to add to 10? How do I add to 9? You can do cueing, choral responses. Everybody answers at the same time. And we do one thing until either I'm starting to lose them or I'm pretty confident that 80% of them have it. They felt that the kids can't tell time very well, and they definitely do not understand elapsed time. So they can skip count from 5s to 100. We knew they had to be able to do that, so we practiced that. We practiced skip counting forward and backward by 15s up to 60 because a lot of the kids struggle with it. We started out with a hundreds chart, but they put together just a quick slideshow of things that they could practice once a week, here and there, not every one of them on a day. Whiteboards telling time. The link in the bottom takes them to a clock that they simply can spin, and they can have the kids tell the time. They spend 3-4 minutes on that, and then they move to the next thing. Need this to move without shutting it off, people. That does not want to move for me, and it's where we're at. So we just went through each of these different things in the different classrooms for a minute, 2 minutes each, and go to the next one. Because they did it on their whiteboards and they created a slideshow and be able to do it, there's little to no planning except for at the very beginning, and there's no correcting. We have to think about what's reasonable and doable for us. It can be something that we do at the beginning of the class. It can be something we do in the middle of the class, whatever that looks like, or you think it needs to look like in your classroom. If we take a look back at the gradual release model that we've looked at before, this multiple opportunities to practice. When we're in the guided instruction phase, remain in this phase until you see they're ready to move to the next phase based on formative data. That's exactly what we're talking about. They have multiple opportunities to respond, and we're looking at the formative data to see if they're ready to go. Same thing when we move into independent practice. We're looking to give them targeted, timely feedback before we are ready to release them into doing more difficult problems. Practice makes perfect. Perfect practice makes permanent. Bad practice also makes permanent. If we want them to have the skills, our practice has to be perfect. The only way we're going to do that is to increase the amount of feedback we give them so that they can correct it as immediately as possible. What does opportunities to respond look like? New skills practiced many times, especially during initial practice, especially when they're in the acquisition level and they're learning it. Then we're going to move to give them distributed practice and cumulative practice over the time. It's going to increase student participation and engagement. How we get them to respond, it might be different ways. You can use games, you can use activities, but anything that we can give them the most immediate feedback is what we should start with and do first. Eventually, we move into providing them opportunities where they can generalize and adapt their knowledge and apply to story problems. If I walk into a classroom and we're thinking about what does this look like, it's the teacher on their feet. It's them working at a brisk pace, giving formative feedback to students, and doing multiple problems with the students 2/3 of the time. The students should be working 2/3 of the period, with the teacher really doing the explicit instruction for no more than 1/3 of the period. We can provide those multiple opportunities to respond in different grouping formats. Different groups are shown to be a very effective method of instruction. We're constantly using the data to either form those groups or decide how quickly we're going to move, how many problems we need to do, what pace we need to move at. All of those decisions that we're making is allowing us to differentiate that instruction. We can consider it part of our management in the classroom. We can consider it management of the time that we have. We have a limited amount of time that we need to teach those students and for those students to learn. And so the more opportunities we can give them to practice in the time that we have allowed, the more successful they're going to be. The more successful they are is going to provide that motivation so they keep working harder and are willing to do more and learn more and be excited about it. So think about this. What would that look like in your classroom? How can we provide additional opportunities to practice and respond? What are some different ways that we can get them to respond? How can we provide immediate feedback when we have 20 to 30 kids in the classroom and give that immediate feedback before we do the next problem? That doesn't have to be individual student by student. If I'm looking around and there's only one student that got it wrong, I still want to give some quick feedback, reteach, do a problem over, then let's all do another one. If that student still isn't getting it, I know that's the student that I need to work with later. That's how I can support those students in my class. I've kept mentioning the idea of immediate and corrective feedback. When we depart our evaluation, it is not necessarily evaluation that is going to go in the grade book, but it's my evaluation of whether a student has the skills and the information that they are successful and ready to move to the next step. When we think about it in that acquisition model that we talked about earlier, in that acquisition phase is where we want to give the most frequent, the most immediate feedback. As we move through the fluency and on to the generalization, our feedback will start to become less. But as long as they're acquiring the skill and they are not accurate with that skill yet, it's important that we are able to give immediate feedback. If we think about what implication does lack of immediate corrective feedback have on a student's ability to correctly complete a task, I think one of the best things that helps to hit home and help us understand that is if we have ever read an Amelia Bedelia book and the mistakes that Amelia Bedelia makes because of her interpretation of what we tell her to do. When Amelia Bedelia was told to dust the furniture, she did exactly that. She dusted the furniture. Now, if someone had noticed what she was doing immediately, that would have changed how the cleaning up had to happen afterwards. When Amelia Bedelia was asked to dress the turkey, she did exactly that. She dressed the turkey. If we are able to immediately step in and correct the mistake before they move on, we will change how they complete the job or the assignment that we give. Now, something I want to consider is, do misunderstandings happen in our classrooms? Do sometimes the directions that we give get incorrectly misinterpreted by the students? And how do we always react to them? I don't know about you, but sometimes I kind of felt like they were doing it on purpose. And I would get frustrated rather than realizing that it probably comes back to me. How can I give that feedback more explicitly, more directly, but more importantly, how do I give that to start with? So what implication does lack of immediate feedback have on a student's ability to complete the task correctly? If we want them to complete it correctly, and if we want them to move forward on any problem, that feedback has to be given to them over and over again in a supportive manner until they get it right. I know in my first years of teaching, that always didn't happen. I would give them the assignment, they'd come back with it done the next day. I didn't look at it until that night, and by then we'd gone on to the next step. It didn't take much to learn that if I would take the time and pull out the whiteboards the next day and check before we kept going, I could give that immediate feedback and correct those mistakes and misunderstandings before we move to the next part. Again, remember, if you are teaching an acquisition skill, if it's new learning, if it's a novice, we need to provide that feedback as soon as possible after a response and directly tied to whatever it is the student's actions or work were. What does immediate mean? As soon as possible after a response. One response. If they got that first one wrong, we know they're going to get the second one wrong. So there's no need to go on to that second one until we can take a look at that. Why should we provide immediate feedback? We've touched base on a little bit of these things already, but the number one reason is because it increases the rate of student mastery. Right now, we only have about 40% of our kids proficient. If we can give them more immediate feedback and practice is more perfect, we're going to ensure much more successful learning. Why are we going to provide it? It removes any confusion that the student might have of what they're doing. Again, it's going to ensure and move on to much more successful learning. That's an interesting one. There are 3 types of student responses that we might get to a math question. We're going to get the correct response, we're going to get the incorrect response, and then sometimes we get the off-topic response. Means they probably don't really know the answer, but they keep going. There's 3 ways that we can give feedback to those responses. If it's a correct response, we're going to praise it. We're going to give affirmative feedback. If it's an incorrect response, we give corrective feedback. If it's an off-topic response, we're going to try to reset the student back to what we asked in the first place. So let's take a look at what that means. If I'm aligning my feedback to a response, there are the 3 types of responses we had in the first place: correct, incorrect, off-topic. And the type of response we're going to give to those type of responses: affirmative, corrective, or reset. We're going to take just a little bit of time to look at what are the strategies that we would use in those 3 different ways to give feedback and what that looks like from the teacher's perspective and what effect that has on the student. So we're going to start with that first one, affirmative feedback, what it means to reinforce and restate. There are lots of things we should do. We have to remember that our body language is one of the biggest things that a student notices and reacts to. When we talk about having a relationship with the student, they read the relationship by what they think our body language is showing them. We should praise things that are malleable, things that the student has control to change or feels they have control to change. We can praise their effort, we can change their improvement in listening, how much they study. Try not to praise things like, oh, you're so smart, because lots of us, we don't have the ability to change how smart we are. We can put in a lot more effort and we'll feel smarter, but just by praising that they are smart, they don't feel that's something they can change. Praise hard work if they didn't really put in hard work. Okay, we want them to know that it takes hard work and what it takes to be successful. Don't just say good job, and we're going to talk about that in a second. What would we say in order to make that better? So let's say that the question was, what polygon is this? Point to the hexagon on the board. Student answers a hexagon. You're right, this is a hexagon. We always want to reinforce and restate and have the student end by giving the correct answer. We just don't want to say, you're right. Some of them don't know exactly what they were right about, so we restate it, but we always want to make sure we end positively. When we think about corrective feedback, this part really makes sense, okay? When we're giving feedback, we might explain the skill, we might reteach the skill that the student is missing, we might prompt them to get to the right answer, explain what the correct answer is and why it's correct. The most important part is we model what's correct and we get them to repeat what that correct answer is or what's correct and let them know what their response is. And if they're wrong, don't tell them that a response is just wrong, not without telling them what they can do to correct it. Don't try to make them feel okay by an error by going on and it's okay. It's far better just to model the correct response, let the student give you the correct response back, and then you can praise them for being correct. Always let them end on a positive note. So you say it and they repeat it. So if I say, what polygon is this? Point to the hexagon on the board. The kid says a hexagon. This is a hexagon. What polygon is it? A hexagon. Now I can end with an affirmative feedback. This is especially true when we're working with small groups, when we're working with a lot of our special ed kids, so they get to end on a positive note. This isn't always possible with a big group, but it is very necessary when we're working with one-on-one or one-on-three small groups that we let them end by restating the positive answer and then praising them. Yes, you got the polygon right, and I restate or they restate what is right about it. Another way to do that is to give the answer and to give the choice. So the same question, what polygon is this? The kid says a pentagon. I agree that a pentagon is a polygon, but a pentagon has 5 sides, a hexagon has 6. Is this a hexagon or polygon? Now I've given them a couple choices. I've already explained the one that was correct. When the kid correctly answers a hexagon, once again, I get to end with an affirmative, positive feedback. The student gets to end correctly. Much more motivating than to leave them on the wrong answer and just give them correction. The last one in corrective feedback is revoicing it. What is an equation that equals 20? Well, 4 and 4 and 4 and 4 is 20. So what I hear you saying is 4 plus 4. So I restate what I think they meant, what I assume they meant. So again, they can end up to be positive. I just don't tell them that, well, no, 4 and 4 and 4 and 4 and 4, right? What does and mean? And make it an incorrect answer. I restate it for them and have them end again with a positive affirmative answer. The last one is the idea of resetting, right? The student is giving us an answer that's off topic, or they're going on and on and on. We have to be careful not to cut that student off too early. We have to be careful for calling them out that they're not paying attention. They may have been paying attention to us. They have been paying attention all the time, but just don't really follow what it is we're doing. Again, back to that body language, our positive tone, our positive behavior. Validate the student's response as on track as you can. Prompt the student to get that answer correct. And then once again, end with positive affirmative feedback. So let's say they give us a long response. I'm not totally sure, but I think I know what it might be. What is a polygon with 6 sides called? So we call them back. We may just have to interrupt them. We may have to call them back to what the question was in the first place. Another option would be to ask that question in a different way. What important things should we say about this shape? Point to the hexagon. Well, it's green. It's pretty big. It's symmetrical too. Well, those things are true, but let me ask you a more specific question to help you get to what I'm asking. What is the name of this polygon? If we didn't give enough information in our question to point them in the right direction, we can prompt and give them cues to get them to answer more correctly. So again, there's 3 different types of feedback. We can give affirmative feedback, corrective feedback, reset feedback. These are some of the hardest things for us to change because these are habits that we probably developed over time. But think about this in your classroom, especially when you're giving one-on-one feedback to a student. How can you get that to end with you giving affirmative, positive feedback every time you walk them through corrective feedback or you've had to reset their feedback? Again, there's a video embedded in here for you to watch that's a good example of this teacher giving positive feedback. This information is embedded on the Intensive Intervention, National Center on Intensive Intervention. Giving feedback in the correct manner is shown to have a very positive effect size on students' motivation. And the more motivated they are, the more they will work with and for us. And the more opportunities to respond and the more times we can get them to respond, the more student achievement that we will see from those kids. So it is really something that we should think about. How do we give achievement, and are we giving it in a manner that encourages the student to ask the next question and answer the next question and answer the next question? When we're giving feedback, we have to think about in our planning, where can we build in more opportunities to respond? The bottom line is whatever we're using for a resource, whether it's a textbook, whether it's something that we've developed from our standards, whether it's a unit, do we have enough multiple opportunities to respond built in? Are we assessing those responses either informally in order to give feedback immediately or formally so that we know what it is we need to do and move to next? How can we think about the different grouping formats that we have kids in when we're giving feedback? Our groups, our pacing, all of those things will help us decide what that differentiation looks like. And are we hitting the kids at all levels? Management, we're looking at classroom management, we're looking at time management, we're looking at management of tasks, management of our own time so that we're not spending a lot of times correcting this extra practice that we're involving kids in. And hands down, the goal of all of this is motivation. If they're having more success, it's going to lead to motivation and them doing more problems and having more success and achievement. A quick review and conclusions before we walk away from this. Feedback increases student engagement. That's the bottom line. The more immediate that feedback can be, the more quickly we can get the students on track and getting the problems right. The goal of feedback is to transform learning. We want it to change and mold it so that they can be successful. This quote by Robert Allen is a great way to end what we've been talking about. There is no failure, only feedback. When we give feedback, we can move past that failure and to success. We're going to end by watching just a brief video by Anita Archer. She would be considered one of the biggest gurus on explicit instruction, and immediate feedback, multiple opportunities to respond are built right into what this should look like. Oh man, how come that happened? There it is.
So I have the gift today of talking to you about explicit instruction. Explicit instruction simply is instruction that is quite direct. It is unambiguous with the goal that the students would get it, would understand it, and would learn. We have a lot of confusion around the term explicit instruction, so let me sort of augment and add to that. One question I'm often asked is, wouldn't it be more motivating for students to learn it on their own, to discover it, to use authentic problems to discover it? And it's as if we have set up a total dichotomy between explicit instruction and discovery, but we really should view it as a continuum. And when we look at the research on instruction, we learn what are the attributes of that continuum. For example, if you are teaching children that are novices, that have just never learned this body of knowledge in the past, it appears that they do much better if we explicitly teach them the information, whether it's knowledge or skills or strategies, that we teach it. If they are learning a body of knowledge that they've not learned in the past, they're brand new to algebra, they are new to decoding of words, then they really benefit from very explicit instruction. So those two things, when the student is a novice, when the knowledge is new, explicit instruction would be desirable. But then after you've gained lots of information, you've gained lots of skills, then discovery is much more a viable option, but only after you've had explicit instruction. So one of the things that I also would be reminded of is the research. If you happen to be a special ed teacher, an interventionist, and you are working with struggling students, we definitely know that they are going to gain more with very explicit instruction than discovery. You know, if they had discovered it, they would not have been struggling. And so we need to have very explicit instruction for them. What would that mean? Well, we could actually take explicit instruction and put it into two areas. One is the design of the instruction, and the other is the delivery of the instruction. And the design of the instruction means that we pick important content to teach them, we break it down into obtainable pieces, but then our lessons are organized so that more learning could occur. For example, I often talk about three major steps in teaching children skills and strategies, where I do demonstration, guided practice, checking for understanding. I do it, we do it, you do it. And many of the skills and strategies we teach would follow that pedagogy. But it also means that the students are not only directly taught it, but they have practice. And actually, I'm going to tell you, my concern is often that we're not giving adequate practice. I have constantly hear people say, well, you know, Anita, that is just drill and kill, drill and kill. And I can tell you, we have no reported incidents of children dying of practice. Instead, look at the research, the abundant research from cognitive science and from learning on practice. The students need deliberate practice where they're practicing with a purpose. They need practice that is spaced over time, not all in one session. And they need to retrieve information in that practice. So it's a combination of very explicit instruction with I do it, we do it, you do it, followed with deliberate and spaced practice and retrieval. But here's what I've noticed. I've had the great blessing of teaching for 52 years and do demonstrations all throughout every year. And what I have noticed is that students need better delivery skills than we've done in the past. For example, all instruction needs to be interactive. I say something, you say something, I write something, you write something. All explicit instruction would be very interactive with students actively engaged throughout the entire lesson. And we would give them, we'd monitor and watch their responses, give them feedback on the responses, and we would maintain throughout the whole lesson a very perky pace. So those are some of the attributes of having very explicit instruction. And we know that then I set you up for your ability to solve authentic problems. I set you up for being successful. I set you up to generalize information to other situations. But this means we've got to keep the teach and teacher. And we have to provide the teaching that our students need. So let us never forget the research on explicit instruction, because if learning is our goal, then a lot of explicit instruction needs to occur there. Bless you in your career. May you thrive as an educator.
Okay, and that ends what the last 3 sessions on explicit systematic instruction means. Just remember, explicit instruction, if they're not getting it, there's really 5 more that we can consider. More explicit instruction, more modeling, more practice, more feedback, and possibly more time. Thank you, I guess, and you guys have a great day. Nicole, do you have any questions before we let you go, or we can touch base later? This is a little tricky when I only have one thing. If you want to stop recording, oh, perfect, you did not. If you want to stop recording.